Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Wow, doesn't that feel good? Just so good. And again, my deepest condolences to the three of you on the loss of Elka and so many of her beloved, long-time, many-decade friendship circle. My heart goes out to all of you. And to Jack Greenberg, who's suffered a terrible loss this week, and to our intern, Adam Graubart, who suffered a terrible loss this week. This is a week of a lot of loss in our synagogue, really a lot of loss in the synagogue, and my heart goes out to everybody. This was a tough week. And Larry Person, I'm not sure Larry's here today, his mother was buried this morning. So, a few words in honor of this MLK Day Shabbat. Who saw the Rustin movie? It's called Rustin, okay? Who's going to see it soon? Excellent. Who's boycotting it? Okay, nobody boycotting it? Okay, excellent. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about Bayard Rustin. And to begin, I want to show a short video. One of the things that's less known about Bayard Rustin is that he was a great singer. He was a tenor, and he loved to sing. He sang professionally, and he was recorded in multiple places, which is a whole other part of his story. And I'm going to tell a little bit about Bayard Rustin and some things that I learned from him today. But I want to start because I want to root our conversations in a human being. So, Jason, would you play that video of Bayard singing? This is a picture of Bayard Rustin when he was arrested as a young man.
Nobody knows the trouble I see. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I see.
Remember that picture, because I'm going to talk about the arrest that resulted in that photograph.
Sometimes
this is him with Dr. King in Montgomery, Alabama, for the bus boycott.
Oh, yes, Lord. Sometimes I'm almost to the ground. Oh, yes, Lord. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I see. Glory, hallelujah.
Amazing voice, isn't that? And very rare. Very few people listen to Bayard singing because that's not what he's known for. I find his voice haunting, moving, spectacular. So, who was Bayard Rustin? So he's known, of course, in only ways that are being now expressed publicly as one of the great architects of the civil rights movement, one of the intellectual pillars of the nonviolent aspect of the civil rights movement. And he, in fact, was the one who really deeply taught, okay, we've got a situation here. What? It's not one, okay? It's not one. We have an infestation of these flies, and they seem to like me. So they... It's my hairspray, right? Yes. Cantor, Rose, and I, all through the service, we have this guy flying. There's a whole bunch of them. It's not one. So get away from me. Get away from me. You know, it's another plague. It's a plague in our sanctuary. What can I tell you? We seem to have an infestation. We can't figure out where they're from. So what can I tell you? Welcome to CBST. What? It's not a flood. We're happy it's not a flood. It's another plague in the sanctuary that's not a flood. Fantastic. So Bayard Rustin was raised in Westchester, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, as a Quaker. His grandmother, who was a very prominent Quaker in the Philadelphia area, raised him in the spirit of Quakerism and in nonviolence. And in the 30s, and his story is an amazing story, he got involved in social justice issues, and for 2 years was part of the Communist Party, because the Communist Party was the center of anti-racist work then. Hold on to that thought, because that proved to be a problem later on. But Bayard Rustin, in his commitment to nonviolence from his childhood, then took that commitment of nonviolence and in 1947 and 48 went to India to study Gandhian nonviolence. And he studied with the community in India, and he brought back that knowledge to the United States, and then ultimately to Dr. King. Bayard Rustin was a little older than King and was really King's mentor and teacher. And in the 40s, during the war, he was doing things like 1942, he boarded a bus in Louisville, bound for Nashville, and sat in the second row. Sound familiar? Not legal to do. A number of drivers asked him to move to the back, which he refused to do. And the bus was stopped by police 13 miles north of Nashville, and he was brutally beaten and arrested. And that photograph is from that arrest as a young man, not the Bayard Rustin, as an older man. He spoke about his decision to get arrested and how that moment clarified his understanding and thinking about the world as a gay person. And now I quote from Bayard Rustin. As I was going by the second seat to go to the rear, a white child reached out for the ring necktie I was wearing, pulled it, whereupon his mother said to him, "Don't touch that N-word." I thought to myself, now it's Bayard speaking, if I go and sit quietly at the back of that bus now, that child who was so innocent of race relations that it was going to play with me will have seen so many blacks go to the back and sit down quietly that it's going to end up saying, they like it back there. I've never seen anybody protest. I owe it to that child, to that white child, not only to my own dignity, I owe it to that child that they should be educated to know that blacks do not want to sit in the back, and therefore I should get arrested, letting all these white people in the bus know that I do not accept it. It occurred to me shortly after that it was absolute necessity for me to declare my homosexuality, because if I didn't, this is 1942, because if I didn't, I was part of the prejudice. I was aiding and abetting the prejudice that was now a part of the effort to destroy me. 1942. Later in the 40s, he left the job he had been with and started working with A. Philip Randolph because he believed profoundly in the labor movement and in economic justice. And he believed that if we only focused on race separate from issues of economic justice, people would not be free in this country. And with A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who was also older than him, so was a mentor to Bayard Rustin, they planned a march on Washington because the defense industries were segregated, and in most cases, black people couldn't even get jobs in the defense industry. And of course, the US military, while we were fighting fascism in Europe, the US military was completely segregated. So they planned a march on Washington for jobs in the defense industry and justice. And they said to Roosevelt, we will bring black people to Washington, D.C. in the middle of the war to protest. And Roosevelt integrated the defense industries, and that march on Washington did not take place. Bayard Rustin spent the rest of the war in prison because he was a pacifist, and he was beaten brutally while he was in prison and treated horribly for the 2 years he was in prison, and came out even more deeply committed to nonviolence, to understanding that the transformation in the world that has to happen can only happen through nonviolence. Not passive kumbaya, but aggressive in some cases, strategic, and targeted nonviolence. And it was from him that King really learned the depth of what was then known as Gandhian nonviolence and transformed him. So in 1953, remember 42, he was already saying, I'm going to live in this way. In 1953, he was arrested in Pasadena, California, for having sex with two men in the back seat of a car. Consensual sex in the back seat of a car in a parking lot. He was arrested. The three of them were arrested. Their names were published in the local paper. They were in the local jail for 60 days. That was 1953. It took until, I think it was 2020, for Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, to pardon him. So, remember, he was a member of the Communist Party for 2 years, left the Communist Party, but he was then arrested for homosexual activity, and in 1953. In 1955, for those of you who went on the trip to the South, you know this date well. It's the Montgomery bus boycott and the beginning of Martin Luther King emerging as an activist, a pastor, a thinker, and an orator. That's 1955, so Bayard Rustin has a whole career before 55, and Bayard Rustin becomes the advisor to King and to the Montgomery bus boycott, how to do a nonviolent action to integrate the transportation system of Montgomery, Alabama. But so many people protest about Bayard Rustin's participation, even though King completely relies on him. King was a young man. He was in his 20s. He had no idea what he was doing. He happened to be the new pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery and was chosen by the local black pastors to be the leader of this bus boycott. And Bayard Rustin was, in many ways, really helped him shape the whole thing, along with other people, but Bayard Rustin was key. There was so much protest because it became known that he had been arrested in 1953 that Bayard Rustin had to be snuck out of Montgomery in a trunk of a car so nobody would see him because it became too dangerous for him to remain in Montgomery. Not just from the white powers that be, but the civil rights community was very conflicted about a homosexual being in such leadership position in the civil rights movement. King stood by him, but they decided he had to leave Montgomery. In 1948, he traveled to India to learn all the things that ended up becoming so critical. 55, 53, keep those dates a little bit so you can see where they go. And then we know from studying the civil rights movement in the late 50s, from 55 to 61, there were massive campaigns and movements, but nothing changed in terms of federal legislation. There was the Montgomery bus boycott. There was the Birmingham bombing and the Birmingham Children's Campaign. There were the Freedom Riders. There was the Woolworth Counters. None of it had an effect on the federal government. And A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin understood that there needed to be a massive display of black and white support for federal legislation to transform these protests and these rallies and these demonstrations into federal legislation. That it wasn't enough to go state by state, or even in some cases city by city. And so they went back to the idea of the March on Washington, which they had dreamed of in the 40s, to create a March on Washington which had never happened before, to try and transform the logjam that had happened in making sure that federal legislation would take place. And of course, Kennedy was president, and he was extremely ambivalent. And the movie, by the way, is fantastic. Everybody has to see this, the movie that we at CBST showed. There was a documentary called Brother, is it Insider or Outsider? Now I can't remember. Fantastic documentary that came out about Bayard Rustin as a gay man, and we showed it here in CBST with the filmmakers. Came out probably 15 years ago. But Bayard Rustin has been lost to history. Why? Because there was such an effort to keep him out of the front lines because of his communist history, and mostly because he was gay. J. Edgar Hoover knew he was gay and threatened over and over and over the civil rights movement, what would happen if Bayard Rustin was involved at all. So Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin were the brains behind the 1963 March on Washington, and they convinced the other civil rights leaders to have such a march. But it was not a march just about racial justice or civil rights movement. It was a labor and civil rights movement march. A. Philip Randolph was deeply rooted in the labor movement, and the labor movement and the unions paid for that March on Washington. And it was a march for jobs and justice. And that was because of Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph had this deep understanding of how economic justice and racial justice. Bayard Rustin rejected the idea of identity politics very early on, which results in later in his life becoming controversial because he insisted that racial justice was not the only thing that the world needed to fight for. Without economic justice, without caring about poor whites and poor Hispanics, et cetera, the world would not be redeemed. He became very controversial for rejecting the idea of identity politics, which is very interesting as a gay man and as a black man. So he couldn't be it was A. Philip Randolph, and he decided that Bayard Rustin would be in charge of the March on Washington. But it was not possible because of the threats against the civil rights movement by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and Strom Thurmond. Remember him? J. Edgar Hoover released to Strom Thurmond Bayard Rustin's arrest record from 1953, right before the March on Washington, which Strom Thurmond read into the congressional record to show who are these people that are, trying to run this march. So it was decided that Bayard Rustin would not be the lead person, that it would look like it was going to be A. Philip Randolph, but at that point, A. Philip Randolph was an older man. He was not capable of running this project, and he made Bayard his assistant. But it was actually Bayard who, in 8 weeks, created that march. And remember, at that point, there had never been a major march on Washington. Nobody thought it could happen. Nobody could imagine it would be successful. And remember, this is before cell phones or social media. So every contact across the country had to be by snail mail, or people going to events and announcing, or driving cars that would shout the announcements. So Bayard Rustin created a group, which is shown beautifully in the movie, of young people. Many of them went on to great, important jobs, but they were all in their early 20s, and they all were his team to put this March on Washington together, because he understood what it meant to bring together people to pressure the government in a non-violent way, without threats of burning it down, in a non-violent way, to show the power of the civil rights movement. He insisted from the beginning it needed to be white people and black people. The huge gap, of course, as we all know, is that no women spoke that day. Because guess what? Sexism, ... Okay, so we're going to leave that aside for now. No women spoke at the March on Washington, and King was not the organizer of that march. The whole march was designed to create a platform for great speeches, and his was the greatest, but he wasn't the organizer in the way we think of it. It was Bayard Rustin. He has been erased from history largely because of the gay piece that made the civil rights movement anxious about him being around, but also some of his politics, which made it very, very dicey. One of the people he pulled in to work on this March on Washington was a young white woman named Rochelle Horowitz. Rochelle is portrayed in the movie beautifully as the one white young woman who's in the room of the team trying to put this march together. And he turned to her, and she has done an oral history about the March on Washington, which I've read. So it was fun to watch the movie and see how closely they hewed to the oral history she did. And there's a picture of her. And the black and white picture is what she was when she was 24 years old. And he put her in charge of transportation. And she said in the oral history, "I didn't even know how to drive." But he just turned to me and he said, "You're in charge of getting what they hope to be 100,000 people to Washington, D.C." And that's a picture of her more recently. And I tried to actually get her to come to services tonight. She's not well. She's alive. She's not well. But she's one of the great heroes of this March on Washington. What was her job for the March on Washington? Transportation. We sometimes get confused about where the power of political activism is, and we imagine it's all the sexy, fancy, visible stuff. But she says in her oral history, one of the deepest gifts she got from Bayard Rustin, and she went on to be his assistant and work with him for many, many, many years. And she then went on, her last major job in her career was working at the AFT as the political director of the AFT. Again, most of those young civil rights activists were labor activists as well and understood the connections to economic justice. So in it, she says that Bayard's genius was that he didn't let any detail left unattended. He worried about the latrines. He worried about the water. He famously, which is in the movie, rejected there was a team of people to work out sandwiches for the 100,000 people, and they planned on cheese. And he intervened and said, it's August 28th. It's too hot for cheese. It has to be peanut butter. And I say that because so much of the focus on political activism is on the stuff that everybody sees. And the truth is, the way to make the things that are seen actually effective is so much hard work on the detail level. There's no way around that, and Bayard understood that. He sent Rochelle, so Rochelle tells in the oral history that she had these index cards, because no computers, remember? And had an index card for every bus that was coming in, assigned a captain. And again, there were telephones, but no cell phones, no social media. And the day of the march, she and Bayard Rustin were on the mall at 6 a.m., and it was empty. And nobody knew if anybody was going to show up. There had never been a march. There had never been any way to know how many people were going to come. And the police came up to him, and they started taunting him and saying to him, "Well, I guess nobody's coming today. Look at this. The mall is completely empty here. We're on the National Mall looking down from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Memorial, beyond to the Capitol. It's empty." So Rochelle Horowitz tells this great story where he was a fastidious dresser, by the way. He reached into his pocket of his jacket. He took out a folded piece of paper that looked like this. He took out Rochelle describes it in great detail. He took out the piece of paper very carefully, very thoughtfully. He opened the piece of paper. He nodded. He said, 6 o'clock, and He folded the paper back, put it back in his jacket pocket, and he said to the police, "We are exactly on schedule. Everything is going exactly as we planned. This is exactly what I have planned for." And the police walked away, and Rochelle said to him, "What's on that piece of paper?" And he said, "Nothing." We have a lot to learn from the shoulders of those we stand on. And Bayard Rustin is one of them. He spent the last years of his life living in Penn South with his partner Walter Nagel, who was still alive. And we, as a community, owe so much to somebody who understood so deeply the power of real nonviolence, not, again, superficial kumbaya, but real nonviolence, and the power that our job in life is to transform and persuade our opponents to become our friends or our allies, not to destroy our enemies. So today, in his spirit, remembering him, making sure we don't forget our heroes, the shoulders on whom we stand, please rise as we sing what was known as the Negro National Anthem, or the Black National Anthem, is sung in public schools in New York City. I learned this, honestly, myself when my daughter was in first grade, and her first grade class every day sang this along with the American traditional national anthem. So it became so important in my family growing up, and with my kids growing up, and it was written by James Weldon Johnson in honor of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. The Black National Anthem, page 214.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing
May we live our lives to reflect the great blessing that Bayard Rustin is in our lives. And I should add, by the way, we are the only Siddur in the world that has Lift Every Voice and Sing as one of our prayers. Another way that we acknowledge the deep, deep truths that we learn from in so many different ways and acknowledge we're not alone.